Hello again. To conclude Chapter 13, this is Recovery in the West, Part 2, and we're going to be discussing a question here about the plague or the Black Death and how it impacted Europe socially, economically, and spiritually during the 14th century. It came from Asia. The Mongols helped to spread it. Rats originally had spread the plague into central China in the early 1300s. And the rats were fleas, on the horses were fleas, and the fleas were infected with the plague. And as they brought the Eurasian landmass under a single rule, the development of the Mongol Empire facilitated the spread of the plague or the Black Death. And this is the most devastating natural disaster in European history. It ravaged Europe's population and it caused widespread economic, social, political, and cultural upheaval. It reached Europe in 1347. It moves from Italy to France and then into Spain and the Low Countries and Germany. All regions were affected in 4 years. Nearly 60% of the Italian city's population died. Estimates of 38 million deaths between those 4 years. And it was viewed as a punishment from God. And you'd have flagellants wandering from town to town, flogging each other with whips to beg forgiveness from God. And once again, we have anti-Semitism coming in. The Jews were blamed for the plague. And pogroms, anti-Semitic persecutions against the Jewish communities. 60 different Jewish communities were exterminated by 1351. This is 600 years before Hitler. Quartering was another type of punishment used in the Middle Ages. Although murderers were executed, the majority of lesser medieval offenses were punished by shaming the criminal publicly. Sometimes, though, they had pity on prisoners and they let them out to beg for food. Torture is not acceptable today, but this is a very recent development in crime and punishment. Trade declined. The woolen industry declined significantly. One thing that was positive from the Black Death was that the price of labor rose dramatically. Peasants were able to escape serfdom by converting labor services to rent, and this freed them. And in the short term, they benefited from this disease. It created widespread political instability. The 100 Years' War. Once again, the English and the French will be at it. After Philip seized Gascony from Philip, there was huge enthusiasm, as there always is at the beginning of wars. And the French cavalry were still heavily armed nobles in chainmail on horseback with lances. They're still using this style of warfare. The English did have some knights, but they're mostly a crossbow archery infantry, paid foot soldiers. And they're using the longbow. Please be familiar with that weapon. And at the Battle of Crécy in the south of Flanders, the large French army attacked, but the Englishmen decimated them with accurate longbow arrows. At Agincourt, the English defeated 1,500 French nobles who attacked in armor across a muddy field, and they gained control of northern France for a time. And the French are now ruled by Charles VII. In 1429, Joan of Arc made her way to court and persuaded Charles to allow her to accompany the French army to Orleans, and the army liberated this city. However, women were not supposed to be engaged in such military leadership positions, and Joan was eventually condemned to death by the Inquisition because she said that God had spoken to her and told her to do this, and they tried her for witchcraft. She insisted, as the flames were engulfing her, that she was commanded by God to do this. She was exonerated by a court later in the 15th century, and in 1920 she was made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Further French victories at Normandy and Aquitaine defeated the British, and English mostly, by 1453. Cannon will be decisive to the French victory. And the Mongols had improved their original Chinese versions, and they introduced them into Europe in the 1300s, and they were continued to be produced, and that will be the end of the medieval castle, because the cannon can now destroy these large concrete facilities. And the feudal order is going to decline with the introduction of the longbow, because knights are going to be replaced by professional soldiers, and this is the end of the feudal Middle East in Europe. The church is also in decline. We hinted at that in the last video as the papacy becomes more involved in politics. The secular leaders, the monarchs, will attempt to tax the clergy. Boniface will object to this. He claims superiority over church and state. French forces were sent to capture Boniface. He escaped, but he was shocked that he would actually be attacked by secular forces. Philip IV then arranged for Clement V to be the new pope, and for a time now, the pope has to reside in Avignon, France, instead of Rome. And during those years, that's where the pope, the center of leadership of the Roman Catholic Church, was now in France and not in the Vatican. And in 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to the Vatican in Rome, and he's trying to prevent further decline in the fortunes of the Roman Catholic Church. There are cries for reform. It's beginning now in the 14th century. The College of Cardinals elected a new Pope, Urban VI, and the French cardinals did not recognize this pope. And now you have two popes, and this is this great schism that divided Europe, as England will support the Roman Pope and France the Avignon Pope, and this damaged the Catholic faith, because who is really the leader of Christendom? Eventually, in the 15th century, they settled their differences, and by 1450, the church has lost much of its temporal power with the secular leadership, and it's lost a lot of its moral prestige by becoming involved in non-spiritual matters. The full recovery of the West begins with the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning. And how does it differ from the Middle Ages? It begins in Italy. The Italian Renaissance would emphasize individual ability. The intellectual Renaissance will take place in the ideas of individualism and secularism. Secular, non-religious, are the main two characteristics of the Renaissance. Renaissance humanism was a movement based on the study of the classics, what we call humanities today: grammar, rhetoric, poetry, moral philosophy, or ethics and history. At the beginning, it's based on ancient Greek and Roman authors. Petrarch is sometimes called the father of the Italian Renaissance humanism. He sought to find in all those monastic libraries throughout Europe forgotten Latin manuscripts. Cicero was a model for prose, and Virgil for poetry, the two Roman authors. In Florence, the movement took a new direction. Petrarch described intellectual life as a solitary pursuit, as in the Middle Ages. But where the humanists differ is that they believe that their studies should be put to service of the state to improve life here on earth, and many of them will serve as secretaries for all the princes and dukes and popes and managers of city-states. In the 1400s, they also took an interest in classical Greek civilization. Leonardo was a pupil of the Byzantine scholar Chrysoloras, who taught Greek, and he learned this language. Was there a renaissance for women? Some women were educated in the humanist fashion and pursued their own literary careers, as those two Italian ladies did. Human beings now, not the afterworld, not heaven, not life after death, but life on earth is now the center and measure of all things. Realism. The architecture is not so overwhelming anymore. In the High Renaissance at the end of the 15th century, Italian artists had mastered a new technique for scientific observation, and they moved into new forms of expression. Da Vinci initiated the era's preoccupation with the idealization of nature and the attempt to generalize from realistic portrayal to the ideal form. Mona Lisa is thought to be the ideal form of womanhood. The Last Supper was another famous Da Vinci painting. Raphael was another famous Italian Renaissance painter, well known for his frescoes in the Vatican. They're balanced, they're harmonic. This is classical art. Balance and harmony, realism. In other words, trying to recreate what the eye sees. And this will be made obsolete in the 19th century by photography, and art will go in a completely different direction at that time. Michelangelo is another accomplished painter, sculptor, and architect. His figures on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel reflect the Neoplatonic style. Beauty is meant to be a reflection of divine beauty. His sculpture of David began as an 18-foot high piece of marble, and he worked on this for 4 years. Politics, the Italian states, they do not have, as I mentioned in a previous video, an organized nation state. It is a city-state with different regions like Milan, Florence, Venice, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples in the south. And there's a nice map that shows you how Italy looked prior to the 19th century. Western Europe, France was wiped out by the 100 Years' War. As a result, Louis XI established the taille, which is an annual direct tax on land or property, and it was permanently imposed by royal authority, and this helped to revive the monarchy. England was also weakened by the 100 Years' War. It's further weakened by the War of the Roses as aristocrats fought over the monarchy until the Tudors come in and established a new dynasty at the end of the 15th century. Henry VII abolished all private armies, and he established a strong monarchy. Spain will also have a strong monarchy by the end of the 1400s. Isabella will marry Ferdinand, and they take a major step towards unifying Spain after they conquered the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. And that has repercussions to this day with the Basque region and the Catalans. The Catalans do not recognize the authority of the central Spanish state, nor do the Basques. But at this time, it is all unified. And by 1500, Spain is the dominant country in Europe. In Central and Eastern Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor failed to develop a strong monarchical authority, and this will be similar to Italy. It's going to be a large area dominated by principalities, and the Habsburgs will be the main dynasty of Central Europe. The Tudors in England, the Bourbons in France, the Habsburgs in Central Europe. As mentioned, the Eastern Orthodox come to be the main religion in Eastern Europe. But don't forget, the Muslims were there for a time, and there was also a Muslim presence in Eastern Europe, along with Roman Catholic. Ivan established a new Russian state in 1480, and the Mongols were ousted at that time. And that ends chapter 13.